Kennedy and Harper Sterling's first solo trip was meant to feel magical, until a few too many eyes followed them through the first-class line. It started out like a dream. JFK International Airport buzzed with the quiet hum of business travelers and spring break flyers, but inside the first-class lounge, everything was calm. The carpet was thick enough to silence footsteps, the lights soft and golden, and the furniture gleamed like it had never seen a child's sticky hands. Kennedy, the older twin by 4 minutes, walked just a step ahead of her sister Harper, her backpack slung confidently over one shoulder. Harper held her tablet close to her chest, eyes wide with curiosity. Their governess, Teresa Miles, guided them gently through the lounge, checking her watch every so often but never hurrying them. "Remember," she said softly, crouching down to eye level, "what your father always says. Be polite, be respectful, and never make a scene," the girl said in near-perfect unison. "That's right," she smiled, smoothing Harper's flyaway curl. "And today you're sitting in first class, like young ladies." The twins were dressed alike in navy jumpers and white blouses, but their personalities colored the matching outfits. Kennedy had an alert gaze and a natural poise, like she was always 3 steps ahead. Harper was quieter, with a tender softness in her voice and a way of watching people that made them feel like she was taking in their whole story. Teresa handed them their boarding passes, real ones, with bold black print reading Flight 712, JFK to SFO, seats 1A and 1B. "Your father will meet us on board. He's wrapping up a call," she explained. "But we'll get you settled first." The girls nodded. This wasn't just their first time flying across the country. It was their first time flying in first class without either parent present for boarding. It felt grown up, important, and just a little bit scary. They approached the gate when priority boarding was announced, joining a small line of sharply dressed passengers. Kennedy looked around at the suits, leather briefcases, and designer scarves. No one else looked like them, but they stood tall, side by side, their shoulders nearly touching. As they reached the front, Teresa offered their passes to the gate agent, who scanned them with a professional smile. "Seats 1A and 1B. Welcome aboard." The girls stepped onto the jet bridge with Teresa close behind. Harper looked up and whispered, "It smells like hotel soap and coffee." Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin felt like another world. Cream-colored walls, wood accents, and pods with wide seats and glowing screens. Kennedy grinned. "It's like a spaceship." Teresa helped them stow their bags in the small storage cubbies. "Remember, no shoes on the seat. Be polite to the attendants. And Harper," she added, lowering her voice, "no asking if they have Sprite 3 times in a row." Harper blushed, grinning. "Just twice." The girls settled into their seats, admiring the controls and buttons, whispering about the science fair they were headed to in California. Then, like a chill in warm air, a voice cut through their bubble. "Excuse me, can I help you?" Kennedy looked up to see a flight attendant standing at the edge of their row. She had a stiff smile and platinum blonde hair curled into place so tightly it barely moved. Her name tag read, "Deborah." Teresa turned around, still crouching to adjust Harper's seatbelt. "We're just getting the girls settled. They're in 1A and 1B. Deborah's smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes hardened. "I think there must be a mistake," she said, her voice coated in sweet professionalism. "The main cabin is further back." "There's no mistake," Teresa replied calmly. She stood up, holding out the boarding passes. Their father booked these seats. Deborah didn't take the passes right away. Instead, she looked directly at Kennedy and Harper, 2 small black girls nestled into premium leather, and then at Teresa. Her eyes flicked down to the paper as if it had been handed to her wet. She said. "Children traveling alone usually aren't assigned first class, especially without a parent or guardian seated in the same section. That's policy." "I am their guardian," Teresa said. "I'm in premium economy, as arranged. Their father will be joining us shortly." Deborah stared at the tickets. Her jaw tensed. "Sometimes the system glitches." Kennedy, sensing the change in tone, sat up straighter. Harper shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "It's not a glitch," Teresa replied, more firmly now. "Please let them settle." But Deborah didn't move. Her posture was firm, her tone cool. "Linda!" she called over her shoulder. A younger flight attendant stepped nervously closer. "Would you assist these passengers to the main cabin? I believe there's been a seating error." Linda looked at the tickets and blinked. They say first class." Kennedy and Harper looked around. A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper just enough to glance at them, then looked away. No one else spoke. "I'm going to need to see your boarding passes again," Deborah said sharply. "Something isn't adding up here." Teresa's hand tightened slightly around the passes. "I've already shown them to you." "Yes," Deborah said curtly, "and I'm simply verifying that everything is in order. I'm sure you understand. It's important we maintain cabin integrity." Kennedy didn't know what cabin integrity meant, but it didn't sound like something that included her and her sister. Her chest began to feel tight. Harper turned her face toward the window, blinking fast. Deborah finally took the boarding passes. She held them like something she didn't want to touch for long, reading slowly, as if trying to catch a hidden error. 1A and 1B, she muttered. Then, louder, "Strange." "Nothing strange about it," Teresa said, trying to keep her tone even. "Their father is Marcus Sterling. I'm sure you're familiar with the name." Deborah's eyes flickered, just briefly, but her expression didn't change. "Name doesn't ring a bell." Linda, still hovering nearby, looked increasingly uncomfortable. She leaned in and whispered, "Should we just call the gate agent? They can re-verify the seating." "I don't need a gate agent to tell me how to manage my cabin," Deborah snapped. Then she smiled again, the corners of her lips tight. "Now, ladies, let's not hold up the rest of the flight." Kennedy turned to Teresa. "Are we in trouble?" "No, sweetheart," Teresa said immediately, reaching out to steady her. "You've done nothing wrong." But Kennedy wasn't sure. Everyone was watching now. The man across the aisle, the woman a few rows back pretending not to listen, Linda frozen in place. It felt like they were being put on trial, and no one was speaking up. "We can just sit in the back if it's easier," Harper whispered, voice shaky. "No," Teresa said firmly. "These are your seats." Deborah let out a short breath through her nose, something between a sigh and a snort. "This is taking far too long." She tapped the intercom panel and pressed a button. "Captain Harmon," she said smoothly, into the handset. "We have a situation in the forward cabin. 2 minors and a guardian refusing to comply with seat assignments, possibly a booking error." Teresa's mouth dropped open. "That's not true." Kennedy's stomach turned. Linda's eyes widened. "Deborah, they—" "Please remain silent unless I ask you something," Deborah said without looking at her. Kennedy felt Harper's small hand find hers under the armrest. It was cold, trembling. She wanted to be brave, to say something, to do something, but the words wouldn't come. The silence in the cabin was heavy, judgmental, like the seats themselves had turned to stone. Then, finally, a voice, not through the intercom, but from the cabin itself. "Excuse me," said a calm, even voice from seat 1C. "What exactly is the issue here?" Deborah turned. A man in his late 60s sat with a hardcover book in his lap, his glasses pushed up on his nose. His presence was dignified but warm. "I've been watching this unfold for several minutes," he continued, "and I haven't seen these young ladies misbehave in the slightest." Deborah's mouth opened, but nothing came out right away. He set the book down gently. "I'm Judge Walter Green, retired, and I'm beginning to feel very uncomfortable with what's happening here." Teresa let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Kennedy's grip on Harper's hand loosened slightly. Deborah's jaw clenched. "Sir, I assure you, this is a routine seating verification." "Is that so?" the judge said, arching a brow. "Because from where I sit, it looks like 2 girls with valid boarding passes are being questioned repeatedly while other passengers watch them be humiliated." There was a shift in the air, a subtle one, like a power cord had been plugged into the cabin. Deborah straightened. "Sir, with all due respect—" "Respect?" the judge interrupted, is earned through fairness, not assumption. Deborah faltered. Linda, finally emboldened, stepped forward. Their tickets are correct, she said quietly. I saw them myself. They're in 1A and 1B. Teresa turned to the girls. Everything is going to be okay now, she whispered. Harper blinked up at her. Is Daddy here yet? Not yet, Teresa murmured, but he will be, soon. Kennedy didn't speak, but she stared at Deborah the way her father did when he was truly disappointed in someone. Not angry, just done. Then, from the jet bridge behind them, a familiar sound echoed. The clipped steps of dress shoes on the narrow metal floor. Steady, calm, unhurried, and with them, a presence that made the temperature shift again. A deep voice spoke, cool and unmistakably certain. I certainly hope security isn't for us. Kennedy tightened her grip on Harper's hand as Deborah's voice sliced through the air. Children can't sit in first class without a parent. That's policy. The cabin had fallen silent again. Deborah stood rigid in the aisle, her uniform immaculate, her tone cold and commanding. To her, this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was enforcement. And she was the law. Teresa, still beside the twins, inhaled slowly, trying to find the right balance between calm and defiance. You're mistaken. I've already told you. Yes, I heard you, Deborah cut in. You're a guardian seated elsewhere, but these girls are not permitted in this cabin unaccompanied. That's standard practice. Not policy, Judge Green said from 1C without raising his voice. There's a difference. Deborah ignored him. Kennedy looked up at her sister. Harper was staring straight ahead now, lips pressed together, her face pale. Kennedy turned toward Deborah. My dad booked these seats. He said we're allowed. Deborah let out a short, humorless laugh. Of course he did. Sweetheart, I'm sure your father meant well, but he did, Kennedy said, louder this time. He booked them for us. Ask the agent. Teresa stepped in. This has gone far enough. Deborah's eyes narrowed. And I'm telling you, this is over when I say it's over. From a few rows back, the quiet cough of a business traveler drew eyes. But no one spoke. No one stood up. No one helped. Emily Chen, still clutching the beverage tray she hadn't gotten far with, stood like a statue. I'm calling the captain, Deborah said suddenly, turning on her heel and walking toward the front galley. Teresa's face dropped. This is ridiculous. Kennedy squeezed Harper's hand tighter. Harper was trembling now. Her shoulders curled inward like she was trying to disappear into the seat. She's making it up, Kennedy whispered. Why would she do that? Because some people think they know who belongs where, Teresa replied quietly, her voice shaking with fury she tried hard to contain. In the galley, Deborah picked up the phone. Her voice carried into the cabin, clear as glass. Captain Harmon, this is Whitmore. I have a security concern in first class. Yes, 2 minors with incorrect seat assignments and a non-compliant guardian. I've asked them to move several times. They're escalating. I recommend pre-departure removal. Teresa gasped. What? Kennedy froze. Is she talking about us? Yes, Judge Green called out. She is, and she's lying. Deborah turned, her lips pressed into a thin line. You are falsifying the situation, he said, standing up slowly. You've harassed 2 children for the last 10 minutes. They've done nothing wrong. You're the one escalating. Deborah held her ground. Sir, you need to remain seated. I am standing as a witness, he said. You've crossed a line. The cabin stirred. A woman 2 rows behind Judge Green looked up from her tablet, frowning. The businessman from earlier sighed loudly, annoyed. Can we just get this plane off the ground? He muttered. Exactly, Deborah said, seizing the moment. Your disruption is delaying us. Teresa's voice was low, but dangerous now. You are humiliating these girls based on your assumptions. I'm following procedures, Deborah snapped. No, said a soft, exhausted voice behind her. You're following your bias. Emily Chen stepped forward, holding the now dripping cup of orange juice she hadn't delivered. Deborah, their boarding passes are valid. You know that. Deborah's eyes widened. Excuse me? I saw them. They're real. Full fare, first class, assigned seats. Emily's hands shook slightly, but her voice didn't waver. Kennedy looked at her gratefully. Deborah's face flushed. You don't speak for this cabin. I do. You spoke for it, Judge Green said, and now you've made it worse. Suddenly, the intercom clicked on again. First officer here. What's going on up front? The captain asked, clearly annoyed. Deborah turned away, shielding the mic with her hand. We're handling it. Recommendation remains, remove prior to pushback. And just then, like a thunderclap across the quiet, the cabin door opened again. Marcus Sterling had arrived. Marcus Sterling had arrived. He didn't rush. He didn't speak right away. He simply walked into the first-class cabin like he belonged there, which of course he did. Dressed in a dark navy suit with subtle pinstripes, his tie knotted just right, briefcase still in hand, phone tucked between his ear and shoulder. But his eyes were scanning, fast and sharp. He took in everything in a blink, the nervous girl clutching her sister's hand, the governess standing between them and the aisle like a barrier, the older man out of his seat, arms crossed, the junior attendant frozen, the senior one glaring, phone still in hand. His voice was cool, controlled. Captain Harmon, he said into his phone, cancel that call. I'm on the plane. Then he ended the call, turned, and looked straight at Deborah. Why? He asked evenly. Are my daughters crying? Deborah stared at him. She blinked. Once. Twice. Then her eyes darted to the girls, then back to him. You're their father? I am. He said it simply, like there had never been a possibility he wasn't. Deborah's tone faltered. Sir, I didn't realize. There was some confusion about the seating. There was no confusion, Marcus said, taking a slow step forward. There was assumption. There was mistreatment. There was a baseless threat to remove my children from a flight they are fully booked on. Teresa exhaled, visibly relieved. Kennedy's shoulders relaxed just a little. Harper clung to her father's arm the moment he was close enough to touch. We tried to explain, Teresa said, voice tight. She wouldn't listen. She called the captain, Kennedy added, said we were causing trouble. Marcus looked at Deborah. Did you? Deborah's mouth opened. Sir, I apologize if there was a misunderstanding, but... No misunderstanding, Judge Green interjected. Only misconduct. Deborah stiffened. This doesn't concern... It concerns every passenger when a crew member abuses authority, the judge snapped. And I'll be writing a statement to that effect. Ma'am, Emily said, stepping up again, voice trembling but clear. I think we need the captain here, now. Almost on cue, the cockpit door opened. Captain Harmon appeared, his brow furrowed. What's going on? Marcus turned toward him calmly. Captain, I'm Marcus Sterling. My daughters were just subjected to unnecessary scrutiny, threats, and public embarrassment by your purser. The captain glanced at Deborah, then at the girls. Is this true? Marcus nodded toward Teresa. Please show him the passes. Teresa did, her hands still shaking slightly. The captain studied them, eyes narrowing, then widening. These are valid. Full fare, first class. Marcus folded his arms. I know I paid for them. The captain looked at Deborah. Did you verify these? I assumed... You assumed wrong, he said flatly. Go to the galley. Now. Deborah's face drained of color. Captain, Now. With visible reluctance, she stepped away. The silence that followed was weighty, but different, no longer oppressive, but expectant. The captain turned to Marcus. Mr. Sterling, I deeply apologize. This isn't over, Marcus said, his voice cool, even as he knelt to the girls. But right now, I just want them to feel safe. He turned to Kennedy and Harper. You're okay now. I'm here. Harper buried her face into his shoulder. Kennedy wiped her face quietly, nodding. We're okay, Daddy. Marcus stood up, calm restored. The cabin was still. All eyes were on him, not out of judgment now, but awareness. He looked around once. This is what happens, he said quietly, when silence is easier than justice. Then he took his seat in 1C beside his daughters and pulled out his phone again. "Evelyn," he said into the receiver, "we have a situation, and I want it escalated." The flight had barely left the ground, but the turbulence had already hit. Not outside. The sky was calm. The turbulence was inside first class, inside the minds of passengers who had just witnessed something ugly, unexpected, and deeply unsettling. And now, inside the minds of the crew, especially Deborah Linley. She stood stiffly in the galley at the front of the plane, arms crossed, mouth tight, breathing shallow. Her mind raced. She could still feel the heat of Captain Harmon's glare as he told her, no, ordered her, to remove herself from the cabin. She could still see the eyes on her, the disappointment, the disapproval, the disbelief. She couldn't believe it either. How had it turned like this? They didn't look like first-class passengers. That was the thought that had triggered it all. It had been automatic, subconscious even. She didn't think of herself as racist. God, no. She had friends of all kinds. Her neighbor was black. Her grandkids were mixed race. But still, the second she saw those girls, unsupervised, young, black, sitting in 1A and 1B, she'd felt it. Something was off, wasn't it? She had done what she always did, maintained standards, protected the cabin, ensured compliance. She just hadn't expected their father to be that man. Marcus Sterling. She'd heard the name before. Who hadn't? The tech magnate, the founder of Sterling Systems, a billionaire, a public speaker, a media darling, and now the man who had just looked her dead in the eye and dismantled her entire authority without raising his voice. She looked at her hands. They were trembling. Behind her she heard a soft voice. "Emily." "Deborah," the junior flight attendant whispered. "Are you okay?" Deborah didn't answer right away. Then, "He's going to get me fired." Emily said nothing, because they both knew it might already be too late. Back in 1A, Kennedy Sterling leaned against her dad's shoulder. Her eyes were still puffy. Harper was quietly playing with the in-seat touchscreen, but not really watching anything. They were calm now, but not okay. Marcus knew the difference. He sat quietly between them, arms around both, head tilted toward his phone. He wasn't calling anyone anymore, just writing. Notes, observations, exact timestamps, dialogue quotes, everything that might matter later. The whole thing was still fresh, still raw. The cabin was quieter than usual. The other first-class passengers were clearly trying not to look, but he could feel their glances, their unease, their guilt. Good. Let them sit with it for a while. "Daddy?" Harper's voice was soft. "Yes, baby?" "Are we still going to London?" He turned to her, smiled gently. "Of course. Nothing's stopping us." "Even after that?" "Especially after that." She nodded, serious, and leaned back into his side. A few rows back, the man in 4C shifted uncomfortably, a hedge fund manager from Connecticut. He'd watched the whole incident and said nothing. Not out of agreement, but habit. Don't get involved. Don't rock the boat. Now he wasn't so sure. He took out his phone and began drafting an email. "To whom it may concern, I was a passenger on Flight 411 from JFK to London today. I feel it's important to report what I witnessed before takeoff." 2 hours into the flight, Captain Harmon walked down the aisle. Slowly, carefully, he reached 1C, cleared his throat. "Mr. Sterling?" Marcus looked up. "Yes?" "I'd like to offer another apology on behalf of the airline. What happened before boarding was unacceptable," Marcus finished for him. "Yes, it was." The captain nodded. "I've logged an incident report, and I've contacted corporate already. You'll be met at the gate." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "By who?" "Our London head of operations, possibly more." "Good. I'll have my people there too." There was a pause. "I understand if you don't want to fly with us again," the captain said. Marcus looked at his daughters, then back at the captain. "That depends on what happens next." In the back galley, Emily was shaking. She hadn't been the one who confronted the children. She hadn't lied. She hadn't escalated. But she hadn't intervened either. She kept replaying it in her head, the girls' faces, the tears, the quivering voices. The moment Deborah snatched the boarding passes from her hands, the moment Harper tried to speak and was cut off. She could have said something. She should have said something. But she didn't. And now she wasn't sure if that made her just as bad. Hours passed. Meals were served. Movies played. Lights dimmed. And yet the tension in the cabin never quite faded. Even the usual luxury felt muted. The girls eventually slept. Marcus stayed awake, working quietly on his laptop, occasionally glancing down at them, checking their breathing, brushing a curl off Kennedy's forehead. They were safe now, but not untouched. And Marcus Sterling didn't let things go. Not when it came to his family. When the wheels touched down in London, everything kicked into motion. As the plane taxied, Marcus got a text. "They're here, just outside the gate, waiting on you." He nodded once to himself. When the seatbelt sign pinged off, the other passengers started gathering their things. Marcus didn't move. Neither did the flight attendants. Emily peeked around the galley wall. Her eyes were rimmed red. Deborah was pale and silent, arms folded, eyes fixed on nothing. Then the door opened, and in walked Evelyn Blake, Senior VP of International Operations, followed by a second man in a crisp black suit, one of Marcus's legal advisors. The captain stepped aside. Evelyn moved forward. "Mr. Sterling," she said, quiet, composed. "Yes," Marcus said, rising. "I'd like to speak with you in private. We've secured a lounge." "No," he said simply. "We speak here. Now." She blinked. "I want my daughters to hear this," he added. Evelyn nodded slowly. "Understood." She turned to the crew. "Flight attendants Lindley and Morris," she said formally, "you are hereby placed on immediate administrative leave, pending full investigation. Please surrender your badges and passports." Emily gasped. "Me?" Deborah didn't move. "I have nothing to say without my rep present," Deborah said stiffly. "You'll get your chance," Evelyn said, "but not before the Sterling family gets their justice." Marcus looked down at his daughters. "Girls," he said gently. "Ready to go?" Kennedy stood, nodding. Harper reached for his hand. He took both of theirs and walked them down the aisle. As they passed Deborah, he didn't look at her. She stared straight ahead, jaw tight, eyes unblinking. When they stepped off the plane, the cameras were already waiting. The low hum of the engines reverberated softly through the cabin as the plane finally pushed back from the gate. Tension still lingered in the air like static before a storm, and in the first-class cabin, the usual clink of glassware and murmured conversations had been replaced by silence thick enough to cut with a knife. Karen Peterson was nowhere in sight. Reassigned to the economy galley, she had been demoted mid-flight, visibly, symbolically. Her absence spoke louder than any formal reprimand. In her place, the visibly shaken junior attendant, Linda, and a substitute from business class scrambled to serve first class with a kind of overcompensating energy. Every movement they made was tight, calculated, like they were walking on glass. Linda approached row 2 timidly, her tray of pre-departure drinks trembling ever so slightly in her grip. "Mr. Sterling, young ladies. Orange juice? Water?" she asked, her voice low, deferential. Robert glanced up from his daughters, who were finally beginning to settle into the pod. His sharp gaze caught the tremor in her hand. He wasn't a cruel man, and this young woman wasn't the enemy. She was just a pawn who had hesitated in the wrong moment. "My daughters will have orange juice," he said calmly, "and I'll take sparkling water. Thank you, Linda." The use of her name steadied her a little. "Yes, sir, of course." She scurried away. Zara was curled into her seat like she was trying to disappear, the comfort of first class now feeling like a trap. Amara held her sister's hand tightly, watching every face around them with distrustful eyes. The quiet elegance of the cabin now felt clinical, sterile. It wasn't a luxury. It was a cage they had been told they didn't belong in. Robert leaned forward and lowered the partition between their seats. "Let's make our own little world in here," he said softly. He pulled out a worn paperback from his bag. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. As he read aloud, his voice dropped into a soothing rhythm. The mythic world of Narnia began to replace the cold reality of altitude and injustice. But they weren't alone in their processing of the moment. In seat 1A, the elderly man, Judge Arthur Abernathy, watched with quiet concern. The whole ordeal had shaken him in a way he hadn't expected. He'd seen injustice in many forms during his decades on the bench, but something about this, how quiet it had started, how quickly it had escalated, how many people had looked away, disturbed him. 2 hours into the flight, he stood, walked back to row 2, and addressed Robert quietly. "Mr. Sterling," he said, offering his hand, "Arthur Abernathy, retired judge. I wanted to commend you for how you handled yourself." Robert shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, sir, and thank you for speaking up. It was the least I could do. I've seen behavior like that before. What your daughters endured today, it's a stain. That woman, Karen, she has a reputation. I've encountered her before on this route, always officious, but never like this." He reached into his coat pocket and offered Robert a business card. "If you need a statement or a witness for whatever follows, I'm available. You and your daughters didn't just experience a misunderstanding. You were profiled, and it was appalling." Robert nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Judge. That means a lot." Back in the galley, Karen Peterson fumed. Her version of events had already begun forming in her mind, one in which she was the real victim. Dismissed, disrespected, betrayed. In her retelling, Robert Sterling was a manipulative bully, using his status and money to undermine airline policy. She leaned against a metal counter, venting to a sympathetic colleague. "They're throwing me under the damn plane," she muttered. "All these years of service. And for what? Some rich guy flashes his wallet and suddenly I'm the villain?" The other attendant said nothing. Karen continued, more to herself now. "Well, I'm not going quietly. I'll file a grievance. A damn good one. They'll see what this really is." What she didn't know was that her version of the story was already unraveling, torn apart by witnesses, a 10-year-old's tears, and the cold eyes of a father who wasn't going to let this go. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, Robert had already sent an email. The subject line, "Urgent incident on Flight 101. By the time they landed in London, the airline would know exactly who he was. Robert didn't sleep during the flight. His daughters eventually drifted off, curled beneath the soft first-class blankets. But he remained upright, his mind calculating. He'd spent a career identifying systemic flaws, in code, in business models, in executive teams. What he had just experienced wasn't a personnel issue. It was a cultural defect, deeply embedded. He opened his laptop and began writing a second email. This one not to the airline's customer service department, but directly to Evelyn Reed, the VP of Customer Experience for Atlantic Air. He knew her personally. She had wined and dined his company's procurement team during contract renewals. She was professional, smart, and, he hoped, aware enough to realize the gravity of what had happened. His message was concise and chilling. "Evelyn, my daughters were humiliated in first class today by a senior flight attendant who presumed, without evidence, that they didn't belong there. She disregarded valid tickets, lied to her captain, and traumatized 2 10-year-olds who did nothing more than sit in the seats I paid for. The issue isn't just with one employee, it's with your system that allowed her behavior to go unchecked. That behavior occurred under your brand, on your aircraft, and in front of your other customers. I'll expect to hear from you within 12 hours. R.S." As the hours passed, passengers relaxed, meals were served, and movies flickered on the seatback screens. But for Robert, the flight was a waiting room, one suspended between injury and reckoning. When the plane finally began its descent over London, he gently woke Amara and Zara. "We're almost there," he whispered. Zara blinked, her eyes heavy with sleep, but still guarded. Amara sat up straighter, brushing her braids over one shoulder. "You okay?" he asked them. They both nodded. "You were brave," he said. "More than most adults ever are." As the plane taxied toward the terminal, Captain Olson passed through the cabin once more. He approached Robert's seat, pausing uncomfortably. "Mr. Sterling," he began, "again, I'm truly sorry for what happened." Robert didn't reply at first. Then he said simply, "This won't be ignored." At that moment, as the jet bridge connected and the seatbelt sign chimed off, two sharply dressed individuals were already waiting at the aircraft door. One was a man in an Atlantic airsuit, the London operations chief. The other was Evelyn Reed, her expression tight, her eyes scanning the cabin for Robert. Robert stood slowly, collected his bag, and took his daughter's hands. "Let's go," he said. Whatever Karen Peterson thought she was going to say, whatever spin she thought she could apply, none of it would matter now. Robert Sterling wasn't stepping off the plane as a passenger. He was stepping off as a reckoning. The instant Robert stepped into the terminal, the tone shifted. Evelyn Reed greeted him not as a corporate equal, but as a man walking into a battlefield she was losing. Her handshake was quick, her apology breathless. "Robert, I came as soon as I saw your message. I'm horrified. This should have never happened." Robert nodded once, cool and unreadable. "I want her held, both flight attendants. I want their statements taken separately, and I want to make it clear. I'm not here as a father. I'm here as a CEO whose company spends $50 million with yours annually." Behind him, Maria stood protectively with Amara and Zara, both girls subdued, watching silently as their father turned from protector to professional storm. Karen Peterson appeared moments later, still in uniform, but with none of the posture she'd carried on board. She didn't yet understand the scale of what she'd done. She thought this was a misunderstanding, maybe a disciplinary write-up. She was wrong. When she approached Evelyn, she started to speak. "Miss Reed, Evelyn raised a hand. "Not now. You'll be held pending investigation. Your airline ID and passport. Now." Karen blinked. "My passport?" "This is a cross-border incident. It could become criminal depending on what this turns into. Surrender it." Karen's face turned ghost white. She'd expected backing. She found herself being iced out by the very company she thought she embodied. Linda, the younger flight attendant, stood frozen nearby, tears brimming in her eyes. Robert turned to Evelyn. "You'll keep them both here. I expect full statements and a formal incident log. I want their histories reviewed. I want every passenger on that flight offered a way to give their account." Evelyn nodded rapidly. "It's already happening." Robert leaned closer. "This isn't just about Karen. It's about who let her thrive, about how your systems protect power instead of people. That changes now." Then he walked away with his daughters, not looking back. Behind him, Atlantic Air was already unraveling. Karen sat alone in a glass-walled interview room at Heathrow's corporate office, stripped of her badge, her authority, and the air of superiority she once wore like armor. Her airline uniform looked wrinkled, her posture stiff, her eyes darting. Across from her sat the head of HR, a corporate attorney, and Evelyn Reed, VP of Customer Experience, with a face like a thundercloud. Her union rep looked uncomfortable, shifting papers in a thin folder that wouldn't help her now. "Karen Peterson," the HR director began, voice cold and clinical. "We've concluded our investigation into the incident aboard Flight 101 on August 8th. Karen lifted her chin slightly, trying to hold on to some sliver of dignity. "We've reviewed statements from Captain Mark Olson, Flight Attendant Linda Stevens, multiple passengers including retired Superior Court Judge Arthur Abernathy and Mr. Robert Sterling himself. We also performed a full review of your personnel file." Karen's fingers tightened in her lap. "You ignored valid boarding passes. You verbally harassed two 10-year-old children. You lied to your commanding officer. You have a documented pattern of similar behavior, spanning years, which was previously misclassified as isolated complaints." Then Evelyn stepped in, her voice sharper than steel. "And finally," she said. "You violated corporate media policy by leaking a defamatory and false version of events to an extremist blog, causing measurable damage to Atlantic Air's reputation and share value." The lawyer slid a thick envelope across the table. "This is a legal summons. Atlantic Air is filing a civil lawsuit against you for brand defamation, libel, and breach of contract." Karen's mouth opened, then shut. Her world spun. "You're suing me?" she whispered, almost childlike. "After 22 years of service?" "No," Evelyn said coldly. "You did this to yourself. You just dragged our airline into the wreckage." "You're terminated for gross misconduct," the HR director said. "Effective immediately." Karen's breath caught. The words hit harder than any turbulence she'd faced. Terminated, sued, blacklisted. She had spent 2 decades believing she was untouchable. In a matter of days, she had destroyed everything, and the airline she claimed to protect was now making an example of her. In a smaller, quieter room down the hall, Linda Stevens sat alone, her hands nervously twisting the hem of her sleeve. She expected the worst. Her mind played every moment of the flight in a loop, the look on Zara's tear-streaked face, the fury in Mr. Sterling's eyes, and her own silence. The same HR director walked in, this time with no lawyer, no ICVP. Just him and a notepad. "Linda," he said gently, "your role in what happened aboard Flight 101 is deeply troubling. You remained silent when a colleague verbally mistreated 2 children. That silence made you complicit." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I know," she whispered. "I was scared. Karen, she ruled every flight. If you crossed her, you paid for it, but I know that's not an excuse." He nodded slowly. "No, it's not. But it is context, and during our investigation, your honesty stood out. You told the truth about what happened, about Karen's pattern, about your own failure to intervene." She braced herself. "We're not firing you," he continued, "but there will be consequences." Her breath hitched. "Not fired?" "You are suspended from all flight duties for 1 year," he said. "For the first 6 months, you will attend mandatory in-person training on cultural sensitivity, unconscious bias, bystander intervention, and crisis de-escalation. You will also write a paper on each module." She nodded, overwhelmed but relieved. "For the second half of your suspension, you'll be assigned to a ground-based administrative role. If, and only if, you complete this probation successfully, we will consider reinstating you to flight status." Tears streamed down her face now. "Thank you," she whispered. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a second chance. A chance to be better, to speak up next time, to never again be the person who watched and said nothing. The boardroom at Atlantic Air's global headquarters wasn't used to silence, but today, no one dared speak as Robert Sterling sat across from the airline's CEO, Jonathan Croft. The long mahogany table was lined with executives, VPs, legal advisors, and Evelyn Reed, whose face was set in a grim mask of corporate shame. Robert placed a sleek folder on the table. "I appreciate your invitation," he began, his tone cool and precise. "But I'm not here for an apology. I'm here as the CEO of Ether Stark Industries, whose $50 million annual contract with your airline is now under review." Croft's jaw tightened. He knew this meeting could make or break his company. "What happened to my daughters," Robert continued, "wasn't just an error in customer service. It was a reflection of culture, a culture that let a woman like Karen Peterson thrive unchecked for over 2 decades. He opened the folder. "This contains my conditions for maintaining our relationship." Inside were documents outlining a full audit by an independent firm, mandatory company-wide retraining, the creation of a third-party misconduct reporting platform, and a new program, the Sterling Initiative, a legacy of change born from the ugliness of Flight 101. "You will implement every recommendation made by the Oak Haven Consulting Group," Robert said firmly. "No resistance, no PR fluff. Real change. Or we walk." Croft glanced at the papers. The cost would be staggering. But the cost of doing nothing? catastrophic. "We'll do it," he said, voice heavy. "All of it." Robert gave a tight nod and stood. "Good, because this isn't about one employee. This is about every little girl who might sit in a first-class seat and be told she doesn't belong." And with that, he left the room, leaving behind a table full of humbled executives and the blueprint for a cultural reckoning. News didn't just travel fast, it detonated. Within 48 hours, the story had leaked, first through industry whispers, then with full force across mainstream and social media. CEOs' children targeted by airline racism blazed across headlines. The Sterling name guaranteed attention, but it was the footage, recorded discreetly by another first-class passenger, that sealed Atlantic Air's fate. The video captured the entire scene, the tears, the arrogance, the moment Karen Peterson threatened to call security on two well-behaved children holding first-class tickets. By the third day, Atlantic Air's stock had dropped 12%. By the end of the week, sponsors were pulling ads from their in-flight magazines. Unions were distancing themselves. Public figures, celebrities, athletes, journalists began weighing in. And Robert? He remained quiet. Etherstark Industries released only one statement, brief and surgical. "We do not tolerate prejudice against any member of our team or their families. We are working privately but decisively with Atlantic Air to address the systemic failure that occurred. No further comment will be made at this time." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Inside Atlantic Air, panic brewed. Executives scrambled, trying to contain the fallout, but it was too late. Every decision Karen Peterson had made, every smirk, every lie, every condescending word had been recorded, examined, and dissected by millions. The airline's reputation wasn't just bruised, it was hemorrhaging. At headquarters, Evelyn Reed initiated the largest internal investigation in company history. Karen was suspended without pay. Linda Stevens was placed on probation. But it wasn't just about personnel. Evelyn knew the problem ran deeper. They had to rebuild, from the inside out. At the center of it all stood Robert Sterling, not shouting, not suing, but reshaping an entire corporation through sheer principle and precision. He wasn't finished. Not even close. There's a moment, quiet and almost imperceptible, when a storm ends. Not with thunder, but with stillness. That's how it felt when Robert Sterling stepped off Flight 101, hand in hand with his daughters, leaving behind the shattered remains of a system that had failed them, and so many others before them. The confrontation had made headlines, but what lingered wasn't just the scandal or the firings. It was the quiet dignity of a man who, when faced with ignorance and injustice, chose not fury, but purpose. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He simply stood tall, unapologetic, unwavering, and let the truth do what truth always does: rise. The Black community had seen many days like this one, unjust, humiliating, swept under the rug. But this time, something shifted. Not just because of who Robert was, but because he refused to let the story end with an apology. He demanded a new beginning. And in doing so, he reminded the Black community, and all of us, that silence is not peace and survival is not justice. This wasn't just about 2 seats in first class. It was about the stories we tell ourselves about who belongs where and who gets to decide. Karen Peterson judged those children by their appearance. She mistook wealth for worthiness and skin color for station. But as she learned too late, truth has a way of finding its way through, especially when carried by those brave enough to speak it, even in a whisper. The lesson is simple, yet stubborn. Do not be quick to judge someone by how they look, because truth and justice often come from the very places we are taught to overlook. Like a weathered oak that stood through centuries of storms, the Black community continues to endure, not with bitterness, but with grace. And stories like this add another ring to that strength. Maybe that's why Mr. Abernathy's voice stays with us. Not because of what he said, but because he chose to say it at all. Injustice thrives in silence. But one voice, steady and just, can shift the weight of an entire room. So take a moment to reflect. Think about where you've stood, in airports, in workplaces, in conversations. Were you the one who spoke up, or the one who looked away? If this story touched your heart, consider passing it along, not as a cautionary tale, but as a beacon. A reminder that change often begins not in boardrooms or headlines, but in the smallest of choices, seen or unseen. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply stand beside someone and say, "I see you, I believe you, you belong." And maybe that's the legacy Robert Sterling truly left behind, not just for his daughters, not just for the Black community, but for all of us, trying to find our place in a world still learning how to see.